This is an experiment to look through the history of ideas and the sociology of ideas and knowledge to understand the geography of a concept. And it's an experiment which I've taken to answer the third query that Hendrik put forward, and that is how can concepts developed in the South can effectively be introduced to studies of social processes in the North. So this is an experiment about how to understand the travel of a concept in context with the production and circulation of knowledge, which is geopolitically defined, and then how, to what extent that geopolitics is transcended when it moves from the South to the North, and when it does so, what limitations it still carries with it. So there have been many ways in which all of us have entered into the arena of global social theory. This is my way of doing it. The concept is informal sector, and I've chosen it deliberately because I'm familiar with it, and also my entry into global social theory has been because I started my work in trying to understand the working class, and as I understood the limitations of that concept, I moved towards the engagement of this concept called informal sector, as it got articulated within the Indian discussion on class. And now we have come to a position that we call them laboring poor and not talk of them as class. So, and that is, this familiarity has allowed me to write this paper. So let me start with the major arguments. This is a derivative concept in the way derivation or derivative and Eurocentric origin is embedded in this concept, because it represents the exact binary of the formal sector. And therefore, it became important to ask a question, how has this concept traveled as it moved towards North, and what, in the last 3 decades, how its meaning has changed as a consequence of it being globalized, quote unquote. And I have tried to trace the history of this travel through the 4 major orientations through which social sciences organize its methods and methodologies to understand its own growth, which I borrowed from Burroway, that is policy, professional, reflexive, and public positions. So in the travel, I have tried to show how it moves from one or the other, and as it moves from one or the other orientations, it refashions itself and reinterprets itself. So that is the first section of my paper. The second section looks at its travel into India and its organization in terms of the national economy, commodity production and division of labor, its political and regulatory system vis-a-vis enterprise and labor, together with the way it integrates itself, and thereby allows us to reflect on India's social institutions such as caste, kinship, family, and how it has thereby organized sexual division of labor in contemporary India. And today, this concept has been extremely important in refashioning economic sociology, labor studies, urban studies, household and family studies, and of course has been central in understanding women and work in women's studies. And then I end up by asking a question about how do we understand what, I mean, when we do global social theory and we see how the travel of concepts takes place, how do we understand the differences that organize global social theory? So there is no attempt to suggest there is a global social theory, but there is an attempt to ask a question: what are the methodologies that one has to be sensitive to be able to understand a global social theory? And I do that through the concept of informal sector, because I'm suggesting that given that contemporary globalization articulates itself in uneven forms, in uneven practices and processes, social theory can only be global if it accepts its heuristic and generalizable qualities, not universalizable, generalizable qualities specific to space and time. That is, that there are many space-times today as a consequence of globalization, and we have to grasp that specific space-times and the experiences of that space-times which get represented in the concepts and the theories that we work with. And therefore, they represent diverse renderings of particularistic experiences. So, in order to do global social theory, we need to understand the diversities of these representations in concepts and in theories, and that can only be done if we accept that the experiences of these concepts will be differentially articulated in various meanings as they get located in space-times. So let me start by, in the first section, I start with the concept informal sector, which Keith Hart, a social anthropologist from Britain, who did work in Accra, ethnographic work in Accra, used for the first time in and he published it it's interesting to note that he published it in the Journal of African Studies, so it became universalized. I think if he were to publish it in a local national journal, it would not have become universalized. But in any case, when he used it to suggest that he believed in the modernization theory. So he said that informal sector is the traditional occupations which have not got modernized, and they have therefore not become part of the wage economy, which is part of the formal sector, and therefore it is a traditional sector. And he suggested that some part of this traditional sector could be ritual services, which what anthropologists would talk about religious, because it is about exchange of services in lieu of for doing ritual work. And it could be also of smuggling, gambling, theft, and all kinds of crime. So he put a range of things in the concept of informal sector, and it got picked up since early 70s by the ILO, which suggested that informal sector is something that almost all developing countries have, and that the only way to ensure that these developing countries move toward developed orientation is to support this sector and chip it out to become part of the formal sector. All right. So the history of ideas regarding informal sector went through many stages, but it included terminological reconstitution. So it was from bazaar economy to black market economy to clandestine economy. In some parts of ex-East Europe, it was called crime and subterranean economy. So as it moved forward, a lot of changes took place, and the concept and its interpretation changed over time. But most importantly, there were three sections presented with this, three parts presented to this concept. One was the political, that it related to the regulation of the state. So if the state regulated certain parts of the economy as wage economy, it was accepted. And when the state did not modulate that as wage economy, it didn't get accepted. So the state was the defining characteristic, defining institution to ensure that what is the formal sector and what is the informal sector. And I won't go into the various aspects of all this, except to say that in the 1980s, this concept went through a radical change when it got discussed in context with North America and Europe. When mass production gave way to flexible specialization, there was flexibility in technology that led to sweatshop production, and you'll recall Saskia Sassen's work on this. And flexibility in this model referred to several aspects of production and organization, including technology, but also skills and firms, etc. And as a consequence, it now got located to understand what is labor in the global north, in Europe and in England. And it moved out of only its discussion from the developed countries to that of the developed countries. And then it became argued that it was a permanent, subordinate, and dependent feature of all capitalist development. So it moved out from being a traditional sector understanding to a fact that it is part of the capitalist development worldwide. And with the problems that came up in late 80s with the economic global crisis, it was suggested it was part of the cycles of economy that was then, in East Asia, in various parts of the world. And so it was part of structural adjustment problems. And lastly, it thereby led to many to suggest that it was part of globalization. So the concept now got integrated with globalization studies, with world capitalist development studies, and it also was used in many ways in the first world, in the global north. I don't know if you know, but Harvard University has a course in it, and it's given every second semester, January semester, for the last 5 years. So we now have three new perspectives on the informal sector. One which says that it is complementary, continuous, and linkage, and links formal and informal sector. It is not separate, and therefore it is dependent and subordinate to the present capitalist sector. The second perspective, which is really a Marxist perspective, draws on Engels' understanding of petty commodity production, and this perspective suggests that it relates to the nature of employment or the wage-labor relation, and is a key attribute to interconnected sectors of an economy. And then the third part is related to the Latin American understanding, where it is part of the larger work on marginality that is being done in Latin America. So these developments has made ILO change its position. So from a policy position, it moved to a professional position. It then moved to a public position, and now again back to the policy position, when ILO gives three definitions, three terms for informal sector. One is, of course, informal sector. The second is informal employment, and the third is informal economy. And all three concepts bring together the idea that there is an interlinkage between formal and informal sector. And there is, therefore, statistics produced to suggest that now all over the world, there exists an informal sector and where workers are non-wage workers. They may be organized in sweatshops and other manner, but there is extensive employment of such workers all across the world. And there is another argument put forward that this is true in Europe and North America for those who come from, who are migrants and who are ethnically and racially in different positions. So in United States, it's about African Americans, and in Germany, it's about the Kurds, and in Holland, it's about the Latin, I forget from which country, the Indians from Suriname, yeah. So there was an attempt to replace the concept by radical thinkers in the West. And they tried to replace it with precariat and precariety. I don't think it has been particularly successful to replace it. And it remains today, if you look at the literature, it remains today as being part of informal sector. It is no longer talked about as traditional. It's no longer talked as if it's part of a dualistic understanding. It is about the fact that it is part and parcel of the capitalist system. So what do we see in the last 3 decades? From the late 60s to the present, what we see is that the informal sector has changed, the meaning of the informal sector has changed enormously. And in various places, whether it's Latin America or Africa or in Asia, and then in North America and Europe, different space-time locations have allowed it to get different meanings as it has moved from, and it's traveled from one area to the other. And now, I will just go over how this has happened in the case of India. Because I think in the case of India, this particular national space-time, which I would like to look at, has allowed it to be grasped in a completely different way than it has been in the case of other regions in the world. First of all, India is the only country where the informal sector is not located only in the urban arena. For India, the informal sector is something that integrates the entire country together. So when understanding what the informal sector is, the government of India suggests that it is 93% of the working class of the country. Only 7% of it is organized, and the 93% is unorganized. The government of India has also been able to bring out enormous statistics on this, suggesting that, and in that regard, it has moved from, in the early 70s, from an accepting of the informal sector as a traditional occupation, because of the women's movement, and particularly because of the effort by one trade union called the Self-Employed Women's Association to bring out a commission report on this matter. It has recognized that women are the key workers in this informal sector, and therefore they have been able to locate what are the occupations that women do and what are the occupations that denote what is the informal sector. And they range from all kind of manual work in agriculture and allied occupations to home-based work and to artisan piece rate, to women as placed in traditional, but also in new modern activities. and women as washerwomen, scavengers, domestic help, petty vendors, hawkers, and all others. So this effort by the trade union, women's trade union, has allowed for a new way to think of informal sector, and that is why we have the fact that today the government of India accepts that 93% of all workers in India are informal. And they also accept that the majority of them are women, and they work, all of them work, though they are not paid wages. Sometimes they are paid in kind, they are paid as piece rate work, and they do so most of the time in the household, and they do 3 or 4 works together. So they are also doing work outside the household, within the household, and they create products for sale and for marketing, and that they remain self-employed but invisibilized. And this household work is related to the, as a consequence of growing poverty, and in fact is a reason for the development planning that has been initiated by the government of India. And that itself is a very revolutionary position, because it suggests that all the development work that the government of India has initiated has actually not benefited the poor and the working class. So 93% of the workers are unorganized, and therefore their work is related to the growing poverty. So it's a consequence of poverty, and therefore it's been called the feminization of poverty. And as a consequence, most of they are de-skilled, unskilled, and it is not possible for them ever to get out of this circle of poverty and non-wage work. And that position has led to a new commission report to argue that, to bring out the fact that we are talking now not only of women, but most of this group of people in 2004-5 prices who are informal workers live on 20 rupees a day consumption. And this is very important. 20 rupees is nothing in terms of what we are talking about, but this is the 2004-5 prices, but it is an average 20 rupees per day capita, and that's what they earn. And 94% to 98% have that income. And that is a stupendous, what kind of exploitation it generates. And what is more important in terms of the caste and tribe and minority questions, more than 80 to 85% of all these groups are backward castes, scheduled tribes, and Muslims, minorities. This indicates that there is a relationship between social exclusions and income exclusions, and there is a relationship with that with development and economic growth. And it is in this context that 3 or 4 propositions have emerged that informal economy is something that covers a range of monetized and non-monetized market transactions involving commodities and services which are produced, distributed, consumed, and reproduced, sometimes through recycling. It includes household production and other forms of non-capitalist production, market economies, and this includes gifts, because a large part of obligations, social and cultural obligation, takes place in terms of gifts. And therefore it involves barter and other transactions related to clientage and patronage. It also includes manufacturing and service industries, but we cannot distinguish this work from that which is organized and which is not organized. And therefore, it is very difficult to understand what is work which is not organized and informal, and what is work which is organized and formal. Because it moves in everyday life, it moves and intersects with each other. So, secondly, it's clear now that all the socially deprived, lower caste tribes and minorities and women constantly transit from agriculture work to household work to wage labor, sometimes every day, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, and sometimes yearly. And there is no clear distinction between this work and that work. And this economy is highly flexible. So the flexibility argument, which was in the global north, is now integrally linked to the global south. And it's extremely diverse, it's segmented, and flexibility is achieved by capital through casualization and by labor through physical movement. And this kind of survival economy allows for enormous migration to take place across the country, and allows for new urban settlements to happen in which we have a situation where the country there is a capitalist economy being produced and reproduced, which combines technologies from primitive to mechanized to informalized, and it brings together unfree bondage, slave labor, to free and self-employed labor. So sometimes people are unfree, sometimes they are free. And it allows for different kind of sociabilities to be produced that connects up family, kinship, caste together. All this is not necessary to talk about because this is not a conference on the informal sector and the laboring poor. But this summary suggests that the informal economy is not a subordinated but it is a main economy. It organizes work of the laboring poor at different times and different spaces within different sites as casual workers, sometimes as unskilled, sometimes as skilled, and segments them. And it relates to the absolute poverty of the people. So how do I conclude? I am suggesting that, first, that the informal sector concept remains part of the binary of the formal and informal sector, and that it remains part of the Eurocentric episteme. And it has not been displaced, that Eurocentric episteme has not been displaced. And yet, we see the concept having a different avatar, so to say, as it moves to different space and time. And the reason I took the Indian case is to show how its representation has changed as a result of the experience of the way in which professional social science and policy social science has tried to capture the experience that it contains. So if Eurocentrism informs and embeds itself in the production of knowledge, it does so in the systems of distribution and circulation of knowledge. So I would suggest that there has not been enough sufficient interrogation of this concept that we can actually displace it and use it differently and reproduce this new way of thinking from a new concept. And yet, it has its own benefit, and it continues to be used because of it. Precarity has not had any impact, at least in the developing countries. Most people don't talk of it as precarity. Lastly, I would suggest that it is important to assess in different space-time the way concepts are represented, because then only we'll be able to grasp the experience of the way processes are organized. One space-time is nation-state, and it's important to understand how that space-time of nation-state can help us to organize the way the concept gets expressed. And I have a suggestion that we have to be careful on the use of the methodological nationalism as being not positive for understanding how to look at one space and time. And my last position is that one of the challenges of global social theory is to capture the diversity. And I've tried to capture the diversity of the way the concept has got represented across the globe. So if we agree that power seeps through knowledge in small and big ways, it's imperative to be cautious about its stamp and assert the limit of all knowledge. Conversations across various space-time zones and encouragement of diversity of scholarship is the first step for framing global social theory. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sujata. Now, at one level, your paper looks not simple, not in a negative way, right? But you've taken up a concept which is emerged. You trace it to Keith Hart's work in the 1970s, right, as a primary source. And then it spread through various institutional levels, including the multilateral organizations and all sorts of ways in which it, in fact, be used, although you're also questioning its utility. And I think in one level, I assume what you're trying to do is to concretize the general theoretical issues we've been talking about in these 2 days. But what I'd like to do in conversation would be to try and draw out some of those levels and perhaps to see how you would respond to them. So let me suggest a few questions which then perhaps reflect back on our major theme. Okay, tracing the genealogy of a concept is interesting. And I got the impression that in the paper that what you're also suggesting is that there is a mechanism in global social theory of constant appropriation or reappropriation of concepts, in the sense that it probably doesn't matter where they arise. What matters is the way in which they are then embedded into a local discourse that we focused on, naturally, on the Indian case in this case, with the, I would say, ambiguous result. But on the one hand, you're criticizing the notion as being Eurocentric, but on the other hand, you're finding it as having substantial utility when actually examining the situation of the laboring poor in the Indian context. So what's your position on this? So is this a general theory about the appropriation of concepts? Not so much about the generation. Maybe that is something we tend to focus on, is less important than the recycling, the reuse. You're kind of offering an ecology of concepts here. They circulate, they get reappropriated, and then reused in a context which might have been quite different from the point of origin. We tend to talk about the issue of the origin of knowledge, but I think you were talking about something else, which is the circulation of concepts which can be reused. Is that a misreading of your position, or is that what you're also suggesting?
There are two arguments. One is on the way concepts get organized in terms of the geopolitics of knowledge. A large part of the concepts, and this was discussed yesterday and today, come to all of us because of their of its colonial origin and then its institutionalization within the colonial context. Today morning, Farid talked about classical social theory in that fashion. So these are concepts you are received, and you have to accept them, and you have to work with them. When you work with them, what happens? And when you work with them, you retain, do you retain the concept? Because one position taken by some social theorists, at least within the global south, is you modulate concepts which come to you and fit them to your data. So is that the way to go forward? And if it is not,
what is your answer to your
no, I am trying to show that this is not necessarily the answer, because in the case of the informal sector, it started by fitting it into the context, because it was the theory. Eurocentrism is about evolutionism. Eurocentrism is by suggesting that it would move from traditional to the modern. So Keith Hart talked about informal sector as a traditional African society. And as it moved forward, it became, as empirical data started being fitted into the concept, it became evident that it was about modern society as it got organized within these regions, whether it was Africa or Latin America.
But is it not also something to do with not what we're doing as social theorists, but with what the policy people are doing with it? Because you brought up the question of the ILO, that once the social science concept is appropriated by that kind of agency, by development agencies and so on, that's often when it undergoes this transformation from something we thought had some analytic utility to becoming something which is quite self-consciously promoting a particular model of, I guess, development in this context.
Yeah. The ILO did it in the same way as Keith Hart did it. They actually picked up Keith Hart's work and reframed it as a policy. But as soon as as ILO started giving projects to various professional social labor studies, it started changing because it did not fit in the way it was thought to be fit.
That's my point. Is that level of appropriation by those kind of agencies, in fact, in a sense, a missing link in the model that we're framing here, that they are as responsible? It's not just universities and so on that don't have the right curriculum. It's those agencies which are extremely powerful in shaping the way in which social science concepts are then actually applied to the real world. They have the power, in a sense, to do that.
It's not only ILO, but it is UNDP, and it is all these. It's all these international organizations. They all reproduce. It is World Bank and etc. etc. For example, they make out that the slum is the manifestation of all developing countries, and that's not true for northern countries. So these kind of stereotypes are recognized and circulated by all agencies that produce information, data, and academic analysis. So it's not only universities.
No, that's actually the point I'm suggesting, that what you're implying is that actually we don't have much power, right? It's really these agencies that are the ones that tend to shape these forms of discourse, which then re-enter academic discourse in a circular way. It doesn't go like from us to somewhere else. It is.
Yeah. But it is not only these agencies. It's private funding organizations which fund such research, whether it is in the north or in the south.
But then I agree with you entirely when you try to locate the whole issue in the context of capitalism, the frame without which almost none of this makes a lot of sense. And I've got two thoughts that I'd like to hear your comment on. I mean, one is that in a sense, you talk about many modernities, there are many capitalisms, and capitalism itself is dynamic, not in the sense the business people necessarily talk about it, but because of its constant protean way of being able to adapt itself to new forms of exploitation, creating new markets, creating new needs, and this kind of stuff. That is therefore the whole question of, say, a concept like the informal sector, which tends to become a rigid concept, has itself to be, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, flexibilized, to constantly bring itself into, how do I put it, parallel with, dialogue with, constantly, to the ways in which capitalism itself is changing, is not a unitary phenomenon.
There are two levels which I'd like to answer.
Yeah.
No concept remains
unchanged, no.
Yeah. All concepts change. Over here, we are talking of how concepts remain frozen when they get received within a colonial context. And these concepts, when they are received in the colonial context, are accepted, like anthropologists did with the sacred and the profane. And the sacred and the profane come with Durkheim, and you take it and accept it and fit your theories into it. There is never an interrogation of it. It's when, so in certain contexts, the concepts change and are allowed to change. In certain contexts, they are not allowed to change. And that is one part of the work. And that is regarding Eurocentrism and the geopolitics of. Then there is a possibility to change those concepts when there are interventions that occur not with policy, but with public interventions.
Okay.
And I have discussed particularly that this entry has taken place as a consequence of social movements that have emerged, which
okay.
have questioned the way these concepts have been used.
Okay.
Because the our state is using this concept and is defining what is work. And in the case of India, I showed that, but this is also true in Latin America with dependency theory. So they have also allowed it to be rethought in a new way. So if professional social science also interrogates concept, so does interventions by social
The social movements, yeah.
They reorganize these concepts and question it.
I mean, I'm very glad you raised that point, because I think one of the ideas in the original briefing paper that Hendrik gave us was, in fact, to talk about the relationship between these forms of knowledge and social movements, which actually is not an aspect of our discussion so far, which has emerged very centrally. So thank you for bringing that up. Maybe collectively we should talk more about that dimension. I think I have just one or two more questions, and then I think we should open it to, or perhaps just maybe one more. I've always got lots, but one more, which is is when you were talking about the nature of what should we call them, the labouring poor, and you were uncovering a number of levels of this, the gendered nature of this, the nexus between poverty, social deprivation, gender, casteism, and all sorts of things. I used to do a lot of work in the field known as economic anthropology.
Okay.
And I would challenge some of the ways you're talking about this on the grounds that having worked with unorganized workers, having worked with what, if you would like to call the informal sector, they were actually highly organized. Not in the way a regular perception of labor would understand order, but with levels of social organization, levels of cooperation and reciprocity, levels of sharing, levels of credit, any number of issues there. So I wonder to what extent we are also in danger of bringing in not in this case a Eurocentrism, but a sort of class centrism. Is there such a word? That, you know, most of us being in that, well, now I work in India, in the 3% who actually pay income tax because I'm in the organized sector, that we tend to see forms of labor of this kind as being highly disorganized, when in fact there are quite complex structures within that sector. That's not to deny the issues of exploitation and so on, but to also partly reframe that in terms of the way in which we think about that.
I agree with you, John.
Yeah.
And I want you to ask yourself a question, whether the credit systems that you are talking about, where people, I mean, I would talk about it as credit across kinship structures, which they are forced to take and which therefore allow for a certain systems of hierarchies to be institutionalized. So what you have is not a possibility of negotiating with individual autonomy, but of reconstituting oneself within family and household and kinship hierarchies, because that is the way these transactions take place.
Yeah.
So of course it's organized. All social institutions are organized.
Yes.
But what are the costs at which they are organized is what one has to delve with. And the argument that I'm presenting is that modernity is supposed to, and there's a hypothesis that it displaces primordial affiliations and identities. What I'm suggesting is that it reconstitutes these primordial affiliations, and what we see today in the country of ethnic and caste identities and religious identities conflicting with each other is precisely because there is no fair competition between workers. And they are fighting against each other rather than against the
system.
class
Yes.
and the system.
Thank you.
Yeah.